I'm Nina Fatalberg for Biz News. South Africa has 2,900 soldiers fighting in the Democratic Republic of the Congo since December last year. They are part of a South African Development Community, or SADC, standby force. This deployment that South Africa committed to will cost the country a whopping 2 billion rand. And we have Professor Esterhuyse of the Department of Strategic Studies in the Faculty of Military Science at Stellenbosch University in the Business Studio to discuss this. Hi, Prof. Thanks for joining us.
Good to have me. Thank you.
Okay, can you start by giving us an outline of why South African troops are in the DRC?
Well, it's difficult to digest and work through what precisely is the South African national interest that's at stake in the DRC. Government is framing this against the background of international and African stability, against the background of the withdrawal of the UN peacekeeping forces from the DRC. We've been in the DRC for the last 20 years, and without much strategic effect, I should say. I mean, the UN forces, we've seen about 17,000 UN peacekeepers, not peacekeepers, about 12,000 of the 17,000 was peacekeepers. It's difficult to see through the build-up to where we are today, what precisely motivate government to sustain the South African military involvement in the DRC, and precisely what interest there is for South Africa. Of course, there's the bigger order interest of security in Africa. Of course, there's a bigger order interest of SADC security, and of course, we all have an interest in the security of Africa, but the closer you come to asking the question about South African interest in the DRC, the more you are searching in vain for answers.
Yeah, well, it seems to be the same kind of policy to that of NATO. When one gets attacked, the others are committed to attack as well. But if you look at the DRC, it's actually relatively geographically far from us. Is it really relevant for us to need to go into the DRC to go and protect our interests?
Well, I think there's a lot of questions hanging in the air about the political motivation about South African interest, and precisely because it is so far from South Africa, and for the South African military to conduct a SADC peace mission where we are in essence the lead nation raises even more question, because it puts South Africa in the lead in conducting whatever they want to call that operation. I don't think it's really a peace mission anymore. I don't want to call it an intervention. I don't want to call it it's difficult to digest precisely what kind of operation we are sitting with here. But let us be very frank about this. From an operational perspective, it is an extremely difficult operation to conduct, and for a variety of reasons. It's difficult for South Africa to project forces over that particular distance. The lack of infrastructure in Africa, we can't use the trains for logistical support. We can't really use the road networks for logistical support. We are dependent on the strategic airlift to sustain the forces. And to sustain a force of that nature over such a long distance with strategic airlift, that requires quite a substantive amount of strategic airlift. Of course, that we don't have. We don't have strategic airlift in the South African Air Force. And so it raises operational questions, and it raises quite a substantial amount of political questions about our involvement.
So what are they up against? They're supposed to neutralize, was it a main rebel group operating in the DRC, which the East Community Regional Force has not been able to contain for, 20 years?
Yeah, we're sitting in essence with a complex emergency, if I can call it like that, with the main agent at the moment, the M23 rebels. But the M23 rebels is supported by the Rwandese and a number of countries within the Great Lakes region. And so that makes it a very, very complex situation. I mean, keep in mind that we are supposed to work with the Rwandese in resolving the issue in Mozambique, in the Mozambican counterinsurgency effort that we are involved in. So here we're sitting with a bit of what I want to call clash of interest between South Africa and Rwanda, yet we're working together with one another in Mozambique. So there's the potential, I think, and this has always been to some extent the reality of what unfolded in the Eastern DRC, that there are so many role players involved that it's very difficult to unpack the situation and understanding precisely who are the destabilizing entity and who is supporting who. The reality is that there are so many or so much resources at play in the Eastern DRC, and that there's, for all practical purposes, no governance footprint from the government, the DRC government in the Eastern DRC. So it's in many ways a sort of an ungoverned space where you have a whole range of actors that's trying to take some form of control. But I think, that brings us back to the fact that we are pulling a large contingent from the UN out of that area of operations. And we are now going to replace that with about 5,000 soldiers from SADC. That's South Africa, Malawi, and then also Tanzania, which leaves a whole range of questions hanging in the air from an operational perspective. Just to begin with, in terms of the interoperability between the forces of those countries, to what extent they are aligned, to what extent their logistics. Simple things like the South Africans using their main R4 rifle is a 5.56 rifle. The both Malawi and Tanzania using the 7.62. So it's a difficult sort of alignment that we are sitting with in terms of forces, and eventually a contingent of 5,000. I cannot see how, in terms of the force to space ratio, if you want to talk real nuts and bolts here, how the force to space ratio will allow the SADC force to be proactive, to eventually makes and create some form of strategic effect. If you talk about problems with the logistical support, there's also problems in terms of air support. How many helicopters we will have within the area of operations? Will we have close air support, perhaps by means of the Rooivalk attack helicopters that's not operational in the region at the moment? So there's many operational challenges, I think. And if you start talking about medical support and logistical support, the moment you create some form of doubt in the minds of the soldiers on the ground, you're immediately sitting with a problem of sustaining morale. If you cannot guarantee their medical evacuation, if something happens to them within a relatively short period of time, if you cannot provide them with close air support when they are in trouble, when you cannot guarantee their logistics, it eventually affects the morale of the troops on the ground. And of course, the willingness of troops to put themselves out and to do what must be done.
With restricted budgets, what resources does the NDF have to undertake a peacekeeping role?
That's an interesting question. I found it quite interesting when the president informed Parliament that it's going to cost about 2 billion South African rand. But he was very explicit in his announcement that the expenditure will not impact provisions for the Defence Force's regular maintenance and emergency repairs. Now, that's interesting that he highlighted that specific reality, almost as if he wants to say this is the strategic problem we're sitting with in the Defence Force, but he's not telling us where that money is actually to come from. So let's work on the assumption then that that 2 billion rand is to come from the more or less 50 billion rand that we have in our defense budget. And it is a defense budget that is already overstretched. It's a defense budget that is already raising questions as to how they're sustaining the size of the South African Defence Force with that kind of defence budget. So it's going to create a lot of pressure within the South African defence budget. We need to keep in mind it's a defence budget that is more or less, covering a small amount of operations, but the rest of it is almost exclusively allocated to personnel expenditures, and that's been the problem in the South African defense budget for quite some time. And so, it actually highlights the depth of the problem we're sitting with, because there's very, very little money available in the defense budget that's allocated for operations. And if you then throw the 2 billion that will be required in the DRC into that small pot of money, you will more or less drain it. There's also the deployment in Mozambique that we need to sustain. It's also a battalion plus the deployment. It's a relatively large deployment. And then, of course, there's quite a number of domestic deployments. The South African military over the last couple of years have become the stopgap, the security institution, security apparatus in South Africa. Wherever problems are flaming up, they use the military. So I don't see the ability to maneuver within the defense budget to make provision for this 2 billion rand. I'm sorry to say that.
Well, I remember during the 2021 July riots, the SANDF was reported to have hired, regular civilian buses to get to KwaZulu-Natal. I mean, how can they now afford a war on far away from us?
There's serious technological challenges in the South African military. I made the point the other day that our main logistical fleet, the SAML fleet of trucks that the military uses, was introduced in 1981, and you need to ask yourself the question. And they've been through the border war, through the Bush war, through the war in Angola, the operations in Lesotho. How many deployments? How many of you are driving a vehicle that was registered in 1981? Our fleet of logistical vehicles is simply under pressure, and we will have to replace our fleet of logistical vehicles. That's just one of the problems that our military is sitting with, but it's a vital problem. I made the point this morning about the South African deployment of 2,900 soldiers. On average, I think NATO is working at the moment on a 6-to-1 tooth-to-tail ratio. And that gives you, let's say, out of the 2,900, That gives you about 600 deployable troops, operational troops in the area. The rest are sort of support people, if you work on that principle. Unless the logistical support element is not included in the 2,900. But that's more or less the doctrine that most nations are working on, is a 1:5, 1:6 tooth to tail ratio. So this places the force to space ratio in the DRC even under a bigger spotlight in terms of the conduct of operations.
And there's also lessons from the West. They often get involved in these kind of wars, and it takes them 20 years to extract themselves, and nothing good comes out of it.
Yeah, this is in a way what is happening with the UN mission at the moment. One don't want to say nothing happened, because in the process they've probably provided a lot of protection to civilian refugees and have done a lot of good during the 20 years of deployment. But you have to ask the question as to the strategic effect they had in ending the conflict. In fact, in a very early, the South Africans dealt quite decisively with the M23 rebels. But in the last week, we have seen them all of a sudden returning in numbers and shooting at South African aircraft in the DRC, shooting at South African helicopters, people being wounded. And in fact, in the last day or two, we've picked up, apparently there are South African casualties in the DRC as well. So all of a sudden, we're sitting with a critical problem in the DRC. But that's a very important issue that you touch on, and that concerns the exit strategy. What is the South African exit strategy here? We have a deployment that's approved by Parliament now for 1 year. But what after that year? What is going to happen by the 15th of December this year? Are we going to pull the forces out, or what are we going to do? We don't see an exit strategy here. I haven't heard people talking about an exit strategy. So yeah, it's not quite clear what will happen by 15 December this year, whether we're going to see another round of deployment for South Africa.
Can I, as a last question, just go to the international stage, where NATO has heard that the Republican presidential candidate, Donald Trump, says if a country doesn't pay its fees, he will ask Vladimir Putin to attack them, or he won't defend them. So, I mean, what is your comment on that?
Yeah, it's an interesting situation we're sitting with internationally. I think the bigger picture for me internationally is that we are increasingly seeing the kind of divide that we've seen in the 1930s with the democratic world on the one side and the autocratic world on the other, and that there's growing tension between these two worlds. And there's clear indication there's greater cooperation, in my opinion, in the autocratic world than in the democratic world. In fact, we are seeing, and this is probably what's going to happen if Donald Trump is elected as president in the United States. He's quite clear in his expression as to his relationship with the European Union. I think there's a huge divide. That's a possibility for a divide between America and the European Union, and I think this is part of Putin's plan. This is perhaps part of why between Putin and Iran, they have provided so much support to Hamas, because Hamas is playing into this divide. The American strategic interest that is definitely more focused on support to Israel than on support to the Ukraine at the moment, for whilst Europe's focus is almost exclusively on Ukraine and not Israel. So we've already seen some form of a divide kicking in there, and that one wonders to what extent that was a deliberate strategy from the side of the autocratic world. Yeah, so we're living in interesting times at the moment. I think the important reality for us, whilst there's greater cooperation in the autocratic world, there's also a lot of economic pressures that's unfolding both in Russia and in China, and I think that is perhaps our saving grace at the moment, if you're sitting in the democratic world, that two realities does not merge, and there's a bit of tension between the political realities and the economic realities in that part of the world.
Sure, there's so many flashpoints we can discuss Ukraine as well. Thank you so much, Professor Abel Esterhuyse from the University of Stellenbosch.
Thank you.